Kate Mulefalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. And today I would like to talk about something that I've wanted to talk about for a really long time. And I couldn't talk about it until I actually learned something about it. And I never took the time to research it. So I did, so that you don't have to. Before I start, a little business. Please, please, please subscribe. Check your subscription. Thumbs up. And if you would leave a comment, just an emoji or a thank you, if you do that, I am going to recognize that you did it because I asked you to help me out, and I will send you a heart, and I won't take the time to comment at great length. If you have something that you really want to say, that's fine too. But if you're just doing me a solid by making a tiny quick comment, apparently that plays with the algorithm. It pushes forward the content of my topic and my channel. It gets more ears, and that's the goal, is to get the knowledge out there. So today I want to talk about something that is so synchronistic. This kind of blows my mind. So we've been doing Paul Wallis's book. Which one are we doing? The Eden Conspiracy? Yeah. There are so many, and they're all so good. The Eden Conspiracy. Great book. Love it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, every Saturday I cover a book I synopsize. Sometimes it takes some weeks. If you're writing a book about Marilyn Monroe, it takes a lifetime. Paul Wallis is fabulous. He has a channel, The Fifth Kind. Yeah, that's it. The Fifth Kind. I believe it might be on Gaia. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly it's on YouTube. So let's talk about that for a second. This is fascinating. So about a week or so ago, I thought, the Cathars. I have got to do something on the Cathars. He mentioned it in the book we're covering, and it reminded me again. And I thought, okay, I'm going to commit to it. I looked at my schedule. I didn't have anything like in a couple of days with nobody to come and talk as a guest. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do a little work here, and I'll research the Cathars. And Paul mentioned it briefly in his book, and that was a sign, right? So I spent a lot of time. I did a lot of research. I collated information from a variety of sources. And I'm not going to name them all because they're just out there. You know, you Google Cathar, take your pick. There's a ton of information. And I collated. I put together bits and pieces from all over the place. So I did that, researching on my computer. And then later in the evening, I decided to watch something to relax. Saturday night, I was actually watching an old film of Kate McKinnon doing imitations, something to laugh about, right? And what do I see right next to it, but recommended for you? The Cathars, another article on the Cathars. And I thought, oh, well, that looks kind of interesting. The artwork is interesting. And then who did I see has made this 1 hour long presentation on the Cathars? Paul Wallis. I thought, okay, so I took notes on that too, and I incorporated them into this discussion today. So who were the Cathars? They were a 12th century Christian movement. Sometimes they're called a sect or a breakaway or a heretical, and I don't believe that that's true at all. They were a form of Christian practice. They have a lot of ideas here, and we're going to talk about what they are. But first, I think Paul Wallis did a great job of breaking down how their belief system, their interpretation of Christianity is really derived from Plato. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Plato was kind of new age, for his time. He believed that we are consciousness, that is the center of our being is our consciousness. We existed as consciousness before we incarnated into this physical world, and we will continue to exist as consciousness after this body dies, that your body is a vehicle. and I'm going to be struggling here to read these notes I took because the only pen I could grab while he was talking is a light blue pen. It's a nightmare trying to read what I wrote. Anyway, consciousness chooses to individuate into the material world to learn lessons. As soon as we enter this body that we're incarnated into at the moment, we forget everything that we knew before we became part of the physical world. Why do we forget? We forget because we need to learn. And it's like, why take a test if you have all the answers, if you have the answer sheet? It serves no purpose. You learn nothing. And it has to be a struggle in order to learn and to assimilate it and retain it. You have to go through it. You can't just be handed it. That's what our consciousness goes through. It becomes physical to experience life in the material physical world in order to learn lessons for growth. And we don't remember what everything is because we need to rediscover it. This is what Plato believed anyway. So learning is remembering, according to Plato. And life on earth is about the ascension of the spirit. So one of the interesting things that Plato believed is that there are interdimensional entities, spirit, other consciousness around us that we can ask for help, that we can tap into. A lot of people talk about spirit guides, and I think that's the same thing. I was raised to believe that I had a guardian angel. I fully believed that as a child. To move over in bed, make room for your guardian angel. I think there's a commonality in human experience where this is definitely an agreed upon feeling or an accepted belief that your spirit guides will assist you and you can contact them. All you have to do is let them know, that meditate, pray, whatever, that they're everywhere. And that we were terraformed. In other words, this planet was created. Early church leaders believed all this. This is not like ancient pagan belief. This was a belief system that was prevalent in the early Christian church. And when they read ancient scriptures, they read them from within this context of Plato. They believed this. This way of life, this worldview, this was the worldview of the Cathars. So now you kind of know what the foundation of their belief system was. They rejected the conventional beliefs, many of the conventional beliefs of the institutionalized Christian church. It's important to remember that the early Christian church was the Catholic Church. They may not have formalized the title, but all the people that became the hierarchy of the early Christian church, they sorted themselves out and became the heads of, or the leaders, what they call the church fathers of the early Catholic Church. They rejected, Cathars, they rejected the dogma of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. They weren't into that. They were dualists. Now, what's a dualist? I looked this up in several different places, and I think if a philosopher can find a way to make every statement completely incomprehensible, he or she will do that. They are unnecessarily arcane, obtuse, difficult, complicated. It's nuts. After struggling for a while, I finally just went to Dr. Google and said, explain dualism in simple terms. So here's what I got. The universe essentially is ruled by two entities, two gods in conflict. There's the good God, like good God Almighty. There's the good God who's kind and loving and compassionate and understanding. And that God created the spiritual realm. And then there's the evil side, the two halves of the same coin, the evil side, but they do believe they're separate, who created the material earthly world that's all suffering and sin. Jesus is God number one. He's the good God. And they completely rejected the humanity of Jesus. Now, this was a big thing in the early Christian church and the Nicene councils. They had all these big conferences. Even before there was Las Vegas, they had these church conferences, and they'd all get together and they'd vote on things. They voted on reincarnation. They voted on the role of women in the church, and they voted on the divinity of Jesus and the whole Trinity and everything. So the Cathars were all about the New Testament. They believed that Jesus was completely God, completely spirit. And this is in direct conflict with the conventional church, the Roman Catholic Church. So some fun facts about the Cathars. They call themselves the Church of Amour. Now remember, they're in France, roughly France, some Italy, some France. We'll get more into where they derive from, where they might have come from, but essentially French. And they call themselves the Church of Amour, meaning love, the Church of Love. And a little pun, because Amor, A-M-O-R, is Roma backwards. I thought that was very clever. I am, however, easily amused. So they strive for spiritual purity. They had sort of two classifications of Cathars. The word classification is mine because I couldn't think of anything better. There were the perfecti and the credentes. The credentes were the ordinary believers. That's their believing. And the perfecti were the ones who wanted to elevate their souls to a place of absolute perfection. And so they were a little bit removed from the daily hustle and bustle. They were celibate. They practiced humility. They practiced a strict adherence to the Bible. They were a little bit, the elite without being all braggy about it. They were a little bit like Cathar priests. They didn't have a priesthood, but they were sort of the ones who dedicated 24/7 to the ideas. They ministered, they preached to the people, and they also provided a rite. Really interesting. It's kind of a last minute baptism, if you had to classify it. It was this ritual that they engaged in called consolamentum. Consolamentum, from the Latin to console, to make everything okay at the last minute, basically. So you could call it last rites if you wanted to. It was a laying on of hands on the person who was dying. Usually you'd want to do it before death, and we'll explain in a minute here why it's probably not a good idea to do it unless you're 100% sure you're dying. And it raised a regular person who was dying to a level of perfecti, and they would, like, you're perfect, right? And your soul would ascend to heaven. Now, women could be perfecti. That's the feminine of perfecti. And within the Cathars, people say women were equal. That's not 100% true. Women had access to religious opportunities as men did, but they still had conventional social gender roles. But let's talk about their roles within the Cathar belief system. They could preach or teach like the men. They made up about 50% of Cathars just because there was more equality and more respect for women within the Cathars than there was in general society. So it was a very attractive belief system. It was accepting of women. They were pescatarians. So a pescatarian is somebody who only eats fish, doesn't eat meat or milk or the product of animals. The only animal that they'll consume is fish. And they did this because, for a variety of reasons. it was because essentially that Jesus in the New Testament did the loaves and fishes, they were identifying with that. And they were more strict about their pescatarianism, which is like being a vegan, but you eat fish. Stricter than most monasteries were, but there's more to it philosophically, which we'll get to in a minute. Most of them in the Middle Ages, most Christians in general in the Middle Ages were unhappy with the Catholic Church, with the Christian church. There only was one church. And they were dissatisfied that church people were wealthy, priests and deacons and bishops and all those guys were wealthy. And they didn't like how they got their money. They were selling indulgences. Like you could go to a priest and pay, I don't know, X amount of money for the priest to say a mass. I mean, this still existed when I was a child. I don't know if they still do this, but you'd go and you give the money to the priest and they would have a mass for your dead grandmother, or you'd give money for the priest and they do a novena for you, which is a series of prayers for 9 weeks. You could buy indulgences, you could buy forgivenesses, you could buy little trinkets, little cards or little medals or symbols of the church that people felt imparted something spiritual, and as long as you paid for it. People didn't like that. And they also didn't like, and this is huge, that the priests had control. The church hierarchy had control. Everything was done in Latin. Only the educated knew Latin. So who knew Latin? The church clerics and the high nobility. So they retained power and control over the people by controlling the religion. People couldn't read the Bible. People weren't even supposed to own a Bible. But people couldn't read it because most of them were illiterate in any language, but certainly they didn't know Latin. This was a problem. So the Cathars, they wanted their perfecti, their Illuminati guys, to have a manual occupation. You couldn't just rest on your laurels and be like this perfect soul. You had to go out and get a job. You had to be able to earn money to contribute to the community. And they also believed that if you were able to earn your own money, you would not be tempted to use your faith to make money. Like, the mega churches where they get rich preaching. Cathars were not about that. They used the vernacular in church. So they did their talking and preaching and studying in their own language. So if they were Italian, in Italian. If they were French, in French. This made the Bible accessible. So I'm assuming that somebody knew Latin and was able to translate stuff and then pass this vernacular on to everybody. Like the Catholic Church required that all texts be in Latin. And the Cathars wanted to break down the walls of entitlement. They weren't entirely and wholly egalitarian. There were class differences. If you were a rich Cathar, you were better off than a poor Cathar. It's just the way it was. But they were considered heretics. And it's really puzzling in a lot of ways until you understand, as Paul Wallis explained it, and I fully agree with this, I'm going to let my prejudice be known right away. Religion is a control mechanism, and it's been used by clergy, church elders, and nobility to control people for a long time. And fear is very, very much a part of that. So in the 13th century, Pope Innocent III organized a crusade against the Cathars that was as bad or worse than the ones they did against the Middle East. So, they sent these paramilitary groups of knights, and the knights were landed gentry or their foot soldiers who had the money for the training and the horses and the equipment. They followed a code of behavior. They were beholden to the Lord. And they were like the paramilitary group that maintain the lords' estates, and there was a loose association of people, of lords in various neighborhoods. By neighborhood, I mean maybe county. They owned vast amounts of land, and the ordinary people who were not the wealthy landowner and not the knight soldier class were the serfs. It's a feudal system for the most part. Peasants might be a better word for it. So they usually organized these crusades. You know, they wanted to indoctrinate young people. They wanted to give them something to do. And they'd send them off to go kill unbelievers someplace. And so this was remarkable in the fact that it was unbelievers in their own country, in their own land, and it was fellow Christians. And this was known as the Albigensian crusade, and specifically because one of the cities that was really destroyed was the city of Albi, Albigensian, but there was more to it than that. And we are going to talk about it more. We're glossing over everything for the right now for the moment. Between 1209 and 1229, it was just a bloodbath, and this continued until they had pretty much obliterated them by the early 1300s. The worst atrocity was in the city of Béziers. It was besieged and it was sacked because they wouldn't hand over their Cathars. They only had about 200 Cathars in the whole city. There were refugees from the countryside who were Cathars who fled to this walled city for protection. And what the Crusaders did, we'll just call them that, the Crusaders were sent by the Pope, and the papal legate was told to, kill the Cathars, and the city wouldn't, lots of people, most of the people in the town were not Cathars, but they would not hand over their fellow citizens to be murdered. So the response to that, I'm going to give you a little Latin here. It's been a long time since I've spoken read out loud any Latin. Caedite eos, novit enim dominus qui sunt eius. So what does that mean? This is famous. When I tell you what it means in English, you're going to go, oh, I've heard that before. This is atrocious. This is what the papal legate said. This is the messenger of the Pope who has come to lead these crusaders. When they reported to him, but sir, the people in the town are mostly not Cathar, he said, kill them all. God will recognize his own. And it was later restated by somebody famous, but this is where it originally comes from. It was restated as kill them all and let God sort them out. So between, and the numbers are debated, but somewhere between 9,000 and 20,000 men, women, and children were killed in one day. So this involves somebody famous, St. Dominic. He wasn't a saint yet, he was still alive. He was very anti-Cathar, and he was sent to deal with them before the slaughter. And he had begun the Dominican friars. Now, this is really interesting. Paul Wallis talks about this. I remember learning about St. Francis of Assisi and St. Catherine, and they were both the Nebo babies. They were the rich children of rich families, and they rejected it all and they became hippies. This is kind of how it was taught to us. They put on rough clothing and went barefoot and let their hair and their beard grow, and they respected animals and protected animals. That's why you see statues of St. Francis. He's always surrounded by animals. And they practiced this sort of peace, love, and joy form of Christianity that was not popular amongst the wealthy from whence they came. And St. Dominic was a lot like this. he began the friars, thinking that being sent to deal with these Cathars, thinking that they would change their minds, and he actually he had his mind changed. He decided that they were not the heretics and the horrible people that they were purported to be. He said something about they lived such a good life, you know. The Dominican friars, because they had this role for the Pope to go and deal with heretics, eventually morphed into what became the Inquisition. So Dominicans were the head of the Inquisition. So the total number of people that were killed in this desire to wipe out the Cathars was approximately 1 million people in roughly a little more than 100 years. By about 1350, they felt like they pretty much wiped them out. They didn't wipe them all out, but pretty much. The word Catharoi, C-A-T-H-A, oh, well, it's K actually, K-A-T-H-A-R-O-I, is from ancient Greek, and it means the pure ones. It was especially popular in northern Italy and southern France between the 12th and the 14th centuries, and it first began in the city called Albi. Now, we'll call it European. The European growth or entity of it was in Albi, but it was around a long time before that. They were called the good Christians. They did not call themselves Cathars. That's important to know. They called themselves bonhomme, good men, good Christians. They believed, excuse me, in two gods, the good one, Jesus, and the bad one, that you could equate with Satan pretty much. They believed that human souls were sexless spirits, like not male, not female, and they were the spirits of angels trapped in the material realm of the evil god. So this is beginning to sound a little bit like the story of Lucifer. There was a battle, and the angels that lost, that challenged the good guys, ended up being the bad guys stuck on earth to suffer. It's kind of what they believed. They believed in reincarnation, that spirits would reincarnate until they attained salvation through consolamentum, which was the form of baptism at death. It's a last rite. They began with very few guidelines. This was just an idea that was adopted by people, and it was adopted in different areas around the same time. And so often the true core skeleton of their beliefs, the structure of their beliefs, differed from place to place a little bit, but this is pretty much what was shared. So this medieval modern manifestation of this belief system was first mentioned in 1143 and then denounced by the church 4 years later, 1147. A lot of other popes had fought against it, but Innocent is the most non-innocent one. Innocent III, he tried to get his missionaries, this would be like Dominic, to persuade local authorities to act against the Cathars. But, you know, they were good citizens. They were pacifists, animal lovers. They were equitable, they were vegetarian, they practiced charity. It was kind of hard to find fault with them, except that their ideas were free thinking. In 1208, the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was murdered while he was returning to Rome after excommunicating the Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. So what happened was the Pope tried very hard. He sent his emissaries to get local people to pressure the Cathars to get baptized, get right with God, stop this foolishness. And the Cathars wouldn't change their belief system, and the locals were like, no, I mean, these are our families. We like these people. They're not a problem. And the Count refused. The papal legate, I'm not going to hurt these people. I'm not going to persecute them for their beliefs. So there. And so Pope Innocent had this Count excommunicated. And his legate, his representative, Pierre de Costaneau, was murdered on the way back to Rome. And so Innocent declared him a martyr, and he launched the Albigensian crusade in 1209. And this slaughter went on for 20 years. And at the end of that, the Cathars were a much weaker group than they were when they started. And then the Inquisition finished them off, basically. So let's talk a little bit more about the Cathars and what they were about. They didn't have a central organization. They didn't have like a Vatican. They didn't have Southern Baptist Convention. They didn't have a central place or organization. And as I said, there were regional differences in their practices and their beliefs, but they all came under the umbrella of Cathar. There are no written sources from the Cathars. It was all destroyed. So there's a lot of questioning. Did the Roman Catholic Church exaggerate the threat that they were? Was there a threat? Paul Wallis has some interesting theories about that, and I would say I wholeheartedly agree with him. They identified themselves not as Cathars, but as good men, bonhomme, or good women, or they just called themselves Christians. And the term Cathar was pretty much used exclusively by the Inquisition. There was a church pamphlet that referred to them as Cathars. And in the same context of what was written in the pamphlet, and I think this is very significant, they referred to them as those who ride on a broom or a stick. That ought to sound familiar to everybody here. So the French countryside was heterodox. What does that mean? Lots of different people, lots of different ideas, just getting along, not bothering each other. You could believe something other than the official version, and it was okay. Nobody cared. Snowing again. For example, the Waldensians, these guys were associated with the Cathars. They shared some similar beliefs, some similar folk traditions. We'll talk about the origins of all this in a minute. There's definitely a strong spiritual movement because people died for it, the Cathars. It had a grab on people. This is significant. People were willing to die for it. So it meant something to them. About 1 million were ready to die, but we still aren't sure what the specific dissident doctrine was that upset the church so much. We think we know, though. So the word Cathar comes from Slavic, and it means dear to God or the friends of God. And it comes from a place called Thrace. They believe that it spread from the Byzantine Empire. There were people called the Bogomils. Well, that's what comes from Friends of God, and then that became the Cathars. And the Bogomils came from the First Bulgarian Empire. So in Byzantium, in the East, what eventually became Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, there was already a lot of difference going on. And lots of different, I guess you'd call them sects. I don't know. I'm trying to be careful about the words I choose, but I don't really have the vocabulary to be really accurate. But one group of people who had a particular worldview were the Bogomils, who were dear to God. They were Slavic. And somehow or other, through the trade routes, because of the trading back and forth, their ideas and I'm going to say this wrong, the Waldensians, who shared those ideas, sort of came into France and Italy and spread these beliefs to the people there. Probably this was all derived from earlier groups. So these were medieval groups that I'm talking about right now. But the kernels of these ideas came, as we said, from Plato, but they were mentioned first in Nicaea in the year 325. They were mentioned in the context of the Nicene Council. This was the church council where they voted about reincarnation, and they voted about, we had to memorize the Nicene Creed when I was a child, if you can believe that. I don't remember it. I believe in God, the Father Almighty. Yeah, that's as far as I can get. All about the one true church, But they were discussing, there are records of what happened when these church fathers got together, getting rid of women in the church, getting rid of gospels that didn't conform, getting rid of reincarnation, getting right with who was Jesus, all of that stuff. But they also noted, interestingly, that the early Cathars, these early iterations of Catharism, were totally against second marriages, and they didn't believe in penance as a forgiveness for sins. So I think that's interesting. I don't know how. I think maybe you have to go through the Consolamentum. I'm not sure, but most Cathars, their writings that they had were destroyed. So we only know about them from what their opponents say, their critics. Somehow they came from the early Nicene area, Nicaea, and they sort of percolated around there for a long time, Plato's ideas. And then the next thing you know, they pop up in Byzantium and travel with trade into Central Europe and end up in France and Italy. And the center of where they really got a foothold, Albi was the city, but Cologne also in France, and in the middle of France, the area called the Languedoc, and also in northern Italy. So those are the areas where they were the most popular. So I wrote down, I really like Wallis's theory, Paul Wallis's theory. If anybody knows how to get a hold of him, I've reached out. I don't know. You get these websites that have forms that you fill out, and I don't know if anybody ever reads them or what, but I'm trying very hard to get Paul Wallis to come and talk to us. I think I could talk to him for about 60 years. He's so interesting. Fascinating person. This is his theory, though, anyway, that there's a God, the creator of the New Testament, and his opponent is the demiurge of the Rex Mundi, the king of the earth from the Old Testament. Now, this very much sounds to me like the God the Father, the loving, compassionate God of Jesus, and Yahweh of the Old Testament. I'm just saying. So some agreed with the Bogomils. They had a more specific viewpoint that Satan had been a good soul, like, Lucifer, fallen angel, and had rebelled against God, like Lucifer. And the majority of them believed that the good and the bad were twin entities, like the two halves of the same thing. But the Cathars eventually ended up two separate entities. They believed that these had all the same power and importance, just opposite good and bad, that all physical matter was created by Rex Mundi, the demiurge, the king of the world, and all physical matter was tainted by sin because of that. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. They believed that humans were angels that had been seduced by Satan. Before this war in heaven, they participated in it and formed an army against St. Michael. And that afterwards, because of that, they were trapped for eternity in God's evil realm. And to regain, so trapped for eternity, except you could get out of it, and to regain your angel status, you had to renounce the material world or be stuck in a cycle of reincarnation. So this is very Buddhist. Oh, I was thinking this. And then the note said this is like Western Buddhists, very Buddhist belief that you have to let go of the material world and ego, and otherwise you get stuck in reincarnation, that karmic load that we carry around, and suffer human life on earth, which is corrupt and difficult and painful. It's suffering, very much like Buddhists of the West. But they did deny that Jesus was human. They denied him as being a physical incarnation, and they denied the resurrection, therefore, because how could you if you're not really in a body? They saw him as an angel that had assumed human form, that his physical body was just an illusion, an appearance, and that Mary was either the same thing, like an illusion, an angel illusion, or that she was a human but a virgin. So they rejected the resurrection. They thought the cross was a symbol of torture, an instrument of torture and disgusting, and that reincarnation was what they meant by resurrection. When the Christians talked about resurrection, they really had morphed the belief in reincarnation into resurrection. When you think about it, yeah, I guess that makes sense. The cross cracked me up. Always reminds me of George Carlin, who said that if Jesus were alive today, all the Christians would be running around with little electric chairs around their necks. So John the Baptist, they believed, they didn't like John the Baptist. They thought he was the reincarnation of Elijah, who was evil and who was sent to hinder Jesus through false teachings of baptism. Some even thought that Jesus was 100% in the spirit world, and the physical version in the material world was a false Messiah that had been sent. So that there was a Jesus, but then there was this human Messiah guy, and that he was lustful with Mary Magdalene, and it couldn't be Jesus, it couldn't be, God, because he was doing all these physical sinful things. There are other beliefs. They had other interesting beliefs. They believed that Eve, Eve's daughters had children with Satan's demons, and those children were giants. Now, who does that sound like? The Nephilim, right? They believed the deluge happened, that it was created by Satan, or that the deluge was an attempt by God to destroy the giants. They believed women's allure impeded men's ability to reject the material world. And I wrote in the in the margin, this was late yesterday, I wrote, oh, sure, blame women. Yeah, it's always the women. The men have no self-control. They thought the day of judgment would happen when there were an equal number of the just and an equal number of fallen angels, equal both numbers, and that the just would go up into heaven as spirits, and the fallen angels would go into everlasting fire with Satan. They were pescatarian. I thought this was really interesting. They were pescatarian because animals had reincarnated souls, but even more importantly, like they didn't eat cheese or milk or butter or anything like that. They were the products of sexual intercourse, so they couldn't eat them. They believed that fish reproduced by spontaneous generation. It was a lack of scientific knowledge. I mean, this was a common belief at the time. They denied transubstantiation. Now, that's the strange blood sacrifice ritual called communion, where the host is God's body and the wine is God's blood. And the Catholic Church teaches it really is. I never really thought about that as a child. I mean, I knew that that's what they were teaching us, but I never thought beyond that to what that really meant as related to sacrifice. They didn't believe in purgatory. They didn't believe in praying for the dead, and they didn't believe in praying to saints. They had the one main rite, consolamentum, that had to be given right near death. And if they performed the rite and you didn't die right away, they would withhold food and only give you little bits of water. And they're waiting for you to die because you needed to die because you're now in a state of perfection. You're a perfectee. And if you started to get better, they would smother you. I'm not making this up. So they were pacifists. They didn't believe in war. They did not believe in capital punishment. I'm laughing because of what I wrote in the margin. They thought that reproduction was a moral evil to be avoided, that what you're doing is contributing to a continuous chain of suffering of reincarnation. And I wrote, I'm going to hell. Because I have a lot of kids. So therefore, they believed that if they got charged with heresy, they could get out of it if they were legally married, because it's kind of a backwards, it's a logical error, but I'm married, therefore I must engage in sexual intercourse. Therefore, I would never offend my belief system by reproducing. So therefore, I can't be both a Cathar and a family person, because they're contradictory, which is nonsense. But okay, there are plenty of Cathars who have children, but they thought that that was their get out of jail free card if they got hauled in by the Inquisition. They didn't have a real hostility to the Jews. They worked with them, hired them for jobs, lived with them, hired them as officials in their communities, and this made the church mad. Around the time, right before the crusade, in the area of Provence, almost everybody was a Cathar. The Languedoc Knights, from this basic area, they refused to persecute them. They refused to join in a crusade. This is why the Pope's legate got murdered on the way back to Rome from excommunicating the Count, because they just refused to participate in any kind of persecution. And this is what they said: we cannot. We have been raised in their midst. We have relatives among them, and we see them living lives of perfection. So at first, the perfecti and credentes were what they called themselves. Then they called themselves bonhommes, and the credente were the ordinary citizens, and the bonhommes became a little, flashier. They eventually ended up having bishops, and they had assistants. The perfecti were the spiritual elite. They were better than most societies at the time with women, because they believed that you could reincarnate as either a man or a woman, and all souls had gone through both. So be careful what you say and do to women, because you probably were a woman or you will be a woman. They believed the spirit was immaterial and without sex, without gender, and that women were equally capable of doing what men could do. But of course, they lived in a larger culture, so there was still patriarchal belief. They highlighted the role of Mary Magdalene in their belief system. Not all women liked the Cathars. The famous Hildegard of Bingen didn't like them. She made a big speech against them in 1163. Some established group homes for women called ostas, O-S-T-A-S. And they lived together communally and educated themselves in their faith. But they had children to spread the faith, so I don't know how that was done. It kind of reminded me from the dawn of everything. They talked about these matriarchal societies where men would go to the temple to have relations with the priestesses of the goddess religion, in order for the priestesses to have children. Interesting. So she spoke out against them. They weren't completely 100% equal. They did believe that your very last incarnation, before you were completely no longer needing to reincarnate, had to be male to break the cycle of repeated reincarnation and to achieve salvation. So I guess they're implying that men got the last shot at salvation. Towards the end, before the big purge, they began excluding women from the perfecti. Came back to haunt them. In 1147, Pope Eugene II tried to stop them with poor results. Several church big shots, the sources all mentioned the names and where they were from and who their lords were, and it's really boring. So I just thought I'd consolidate all of it and just call them big shots. And also some councils were held, and they had no luck in trying to change the Cathars and stop them. Pope Innocent III in 1198, he tried peaceful conversion, and that didn't work. He sent legates to them, and that didn't work. He sent the Dominicans, and even they had very little luck. He sent several French nobles and Philip II, and that was with no luck. And he got his barons together to organize the crusade. So what happened was the Pope and Philip II, the king, Philip II, they wanted to consolidate their power and their control, church and nobles, dual control. And they made an offer to the knight class, to the paramilitary guys. And they said, if you join us in this crusade and you help us wipe out these Cathars, you will be forgiven for anybody you kill. Your sins will be forgiven. You will go to heaven, and you will get a bunch of land and property. After the Cathars are gone, you'll get their land and property. That's an offer that a lot of people couldn't refuse. There was no spiritual repercussion, no legal repercussion, and there was an economic benefit. So they went along. Also, there was concern about the young people. They'd been on some of these other crusades, and they came back, PTSD, they came back disillusioned and rejecting of the church as an institution. Ergo, St. Francis running around in bare feet talking to the animals. This was shocking, and such a rejection of his status and church belief. So at first there was a battle of knights is what it was really about. The Albi knights were fighting the Pope Innocent sent knights. And the Cathar lands attracted basically what became a land grab. There was a massacre at Béziers. We talked about that, led by the papal legate, let God sort them out. And this was called the first ideological, I guess they blocked this word out on YouTube last night, so maybe I'm not supposed to say it. But when an entire group of people that was one of the first ideological, and one of the most conclusive cases in religious history. Then there's a lot of sources have hideous descriptions of what happened. It was just horrendous. And for example, they broke down the doors of one church, I believe it was in Béziers, where it was full, just hundreds of women and children and old people, and they were claiming sanctuary. Sanctuary was an actual, an act. You could claim or ask for sanctuary if you got yourself into a church. It comes from the word for holy, and being inside the building of the church imparted a protection. You could not be assaulted, hurt, arrested by civil authorities. The church was committed to protecting you if you came to them for help. And all those people went into the church thinking that would save them, and they broke the doors down and killed them all. So there were atrocities. It's just terrible to think about. 20,000 people were killed, sympathizers included. And then afterwards, I thought this was really interesting. The Jewish Star, World War II. Well, this goes back very much farther. And I knew that Jewish people were forced to wear symbols on their clothes way far back, but sympathizers of the Cathars were required to wear a yellow cross symbol sewed onto their clothing. So this continued. For example, in 1239, 183 of them were burned at the stake at the same time. Popular wisdom, lore, who knows, is that a small number of perfecti escaped the killings at Montségur. They took with them the Cathar treasure. What was the treasure? Nobody knows. This is just a story. Was it true? Nobody knows. Was it money? Was it Gnostic texts, which I think would have been the most interesting? Was it the Holy Grail? Let's ask Dan Brown. In 1321, the last known execution of a Cathar occurred. It eventually became, because they didn't really exist in any substantive number to be like a community or anything, the term became a term of cultural or ancestral reference. You were descended from the Cathars. You used to live in a Cathar community. Their descendants were required to live outside the town defenses. So for a very long time, they had to wear this yellow cross. They couldn't live inside the city walls. They had to live outside from the community. In the 1930s, I thought this was interesting. SS officer Otto Rahn wrote a book called Crusade Against the Grail, and it was a reworking of the 13th century story Parsifal. Search for the Holy Grail, you know. Some historians today say that it was not really a separate secret religion, that it was a spiritual revival in the late 12th century, early 13th century. And the notion of it being heresy was actually constructed by the church. It was made up by the church. Their offense was that they challenged the hegemony of Rome. And this is my theory. I really agree with this, that it was a persecution of dissidents. Now, I also think it was a land grab. They were an imaginary enemy. It was an excuse. Like the witch hunts and anti-Semitism and satanic panic. Popular culture links them to the Knights Templar. Some say they were proto-Protestant. Oh, there's all this academic arguing and theological arguing about them. It's really kind of funny. Just people getting really heated up about the Cathars and what they meant and who they were, and really what was the threat. Some think they're the forerunners of the Baptists. I could see where you would think, oh, they're some of the first groups to really push against the institutionalized and only Christian church at the time, which was the Church of Rome. Then I found something really interesting, and I strongly recommend you look for this. At the bottom of one of the YouTube resources, they recommended listening to Le Boyer, L-O, the Boyer. I think this must be Old French. B-O-I-E-R, which is the hymn of the Cathars. And it's about like a herdsman. And it's where you get the name Le Bouvier. Who do we know whose name was Bouvier? Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis. So her family must have come from that part of the world. Maybe they were Cathars. Who knows? Maybe she knows where the Holy Grail is. That's why they call it Camelot. No. Totally kidding. That didn't come out until after the assassination, by the way. So you can look for this on YouTube and listen to it. And it's haunting. So it's L-O, 2 words, B-O-I-E-R, the hymn of the Cathars. And it's just beautiful. And I will leave you with that little bit of artistic something to think about, to make you feel better. It's haunting. I listened to 2 versions. There's a version of a group singing it, and it's very haunting. And then there's a version of a woman singing it, and it kind of reminded me of Sinead O'Connor singing in Gaelic, but it's Old French. So That's the Cathars, a very interesting group. I hope you enjoyed that. No particular reason. I think this links to Paul Wallis's theories because there's that desire to keep control at the very top, the blood nobility, the religious leaders. There's something there. So look at that. Exactly an hour. Thank you very much for watching. Slán go fóill. Slán.